This week on London Real, we have the anthropologist, anarchist, and professor at the London School of Economics, David Graeber.
They talk about democracy. Democracy, we live in a democracy. Democracy is what makes us great. We're going to kill people to defend democracy. But we don't actually believe in democracy. Everything we do is regulated, everything. But we don't think about it, the fact that you're constantly being threatened with violence every moment of the day. Direct action means try to solve your own problems rather than try to get other people to intervene. There's a natural disaster. Everybody reverts to communism, ironically, because it's the only thing that works. The whole idea of not forming links with political parties, not taking money, is you'll never be in a position where you say one thing in public and another thing at home.
London Real presents David Graeber, American Anarchist.
I think we managed to get the government really scared.
This week on the show, we have the London School of Economics professor, Mr. David Graeber. He is an anthropologist and anarchist activist and was one of the guys literally on ground zero for the Occupy Wall Street movement. He coined the term, "We are the 99%. David is the real deal. He's been pushing against government in a huge way. His entire career was thrown out of Yale in America, which is why he's here in London. He's got amazing ideas, including a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. He talks about the concept of bullshit jobs. And it took me, I think, 9 months to finally get David to come to our show, but it's well worth the wait. He debated Peter Thiel, the billionaire, out in San Francisco last year. He's just really a fascinating guy with so many intelligent lessons about why we innovate as humans. He doesn't believe we do it for money. He says we do it for other reasons, and he might be onto something. The other thing that's interesting is he said debt was the first instrument that was used to trade goods. It actually wasn't money. And so David has a lot of fascinating things to say, and I really think you're going to enjoy. I love getting back to our roots of the Occupy movement and activists, because I think they have a lot to tell us, in addition to the entrepreneurs and crazy people like Dan Pena. So I hope you enjoy. You know, a lot of people have been asking me, Brian, what is this thing called the Academy? Well, if you don't know, it's a secret group of hardcore London Reelers around the world. There's 1,000 of us, and we're building the best versions of ourselves. We get together at the studio every 2 weeks. We have online live webinars. We have exclusive courses. We watch Dan Pena with our day at the Ritz. Everything is happening there, and I made a short video about it, so check it out.
The entrepreneurial journey, it can be a lonely road. I push myself in so many areas, but you know, you can't do it all yourself.
The thing about the Academy is, it's like, look, you have the ideas, you have the ability, you have the skill, and you have the sort of ambition for yourself. But when you have a group of people pulling you forward, it's so important.
Accountability is what's missing from most of the programs or any gurus or any internet mentor that I had before.
I wanted to get some accountability. I wanted to make myself accountable to a group, to you.
The reason we started the Academy is because I felt like we were doing these amazing talks, like we'd have a Peter Sage episode or a Dan Pena episode or a Kala or someone, and you get super inspired, and then YouTube stops, and then you go back to your life and you don't make any changes. And it was just like, it felt like, what are we doing? If you're designing your life right, the good times are now. And in a few years, you'll look back and say, wow, that was amazing.
The thing about the Academy is it has so many different sort of layers to it. I think your web seminars are awesome. The way you broke it down and the style of your teaching is pretty awesome.
I like the feed. When I have to motivate myself, I kind of look at others struggling and getting over those struggles. So I actually follow daily the feed.
Best feature would be the sort of Facebook aspect of it, the social media aspect of it, as in creating a profile with your goals, your dreams.
everyone's on the same vibe, and we may be at different stages in our journeys, but everyone's on the same page at the end of the day. Everyone's really trying to push themselves and building the best you. It really resonates with me.
And the fact that I'm committing a small amount of money and the fact that I'm actually trying to interact with those people means that I'm invested and means that I will keep it for the long run.
You have to be serious about yourself and what you want to achieve. And if you're serious about yourself, this is going to be such a fantastic platform.
London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is David Graeber, who is an anthropologist and anarchist activist, currently teaching at the London School of Economics, previously at Yale. You've been involved in anti-authoritarian social movements such as Global Justice and Occupy Wall Street, where you were credited with creating the term, "We are the 99%. Half term. You've written a dozen books, including Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and The Utopia of Rules on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy. You have debated the billionaire Peter Thiel on capitalism and studied everything from magic in Madagascar to manners in early modern Europe. David, welcome to London Real.
Thanks you so much for having me.
I'm glad we finally did this. I was watching your debate with Peter Thiel last night, and before we get to the rest of the good stuff, I just want to know, what's it like debating a multi-billionaire, the guy that created PayPal, early investor in Facebook, very eccentric dude. How did that happen, and what was that like?
He contacted me. He read Debt, he liked it a lot, and then he discovered that I'd just written something about technology. And it turned out we had one of the same pet peeves, which is we were both people who kind of grew up, what was I, 7 years old when the moon landing happened? We're kind of that generation that we were taught that like all this science fiction stuff was actually going to happen. And everybody said so. I mean, you went to the observatory or went to science class or the National Geographic, they talked about all the space stations they'd have by the 90s and the Mars shots they'd have in 2000. We all expected that we were be doing all this stuff that we just have in movies now. And people of my generation have this common sense of just like bitter disappointment. We didn't expect we were going to get everything, teleportation, anti-gravity shoes, all that kind of stuff. But no, it never occurred to us we wouldn't get any of that stuff. And none of it happened. And he's kind of, so even though politically we're on opposite poles in a lot of ways, there's one thing that like we're both really angry about and we kind of totally see eye to eye.
Right.
And we're both really, not only are we angry about it, but we're actually interested in trying to think of what it would actually take to turn things around so we actually do get there.
Because in his book, 0 to 1, it's funny because the guy that's known for PayPal and Facebook is the one that's so disappointed in what the tech industry has brought us.
Yeah, he knows better than anybody.
Right, and he said, we expected flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. I think is his joke, and he probably was an investor in Twitter. And so he was just kind of disappointed in where's the real technology advancements, right?
Yeah, I remember like going to see this movie. I think it was one of the Star Wars prequels, and it was a terrible movie, but the special effects were really good. And I remember looking at it and saying, wow, I remember those cheesy science fiction like movies from the 50s and like dragging tin cans on strings and stuff like that. And if those guys could see this, they'd be really impressed. And I realized, no, they wouldn't. They thought we'd actually be doing this stuff by now. All we've done is like come up with this amazing way to simulate it. I thought, oh right, simulation, end of history, ironic repetition, hyperreal, all this postmodern stuff. It's really ultimately this sort of cry of pain from these people who expected to be on Mars by now, but all they got is these amazing computer simulations. And they can't talk about that because, nowadays if you say, but I expected we were going to be on Mars, they say, oh, sucker, you're a chump, for like believing this. So we can't actually complain about what we're really complaining about. So they come up with this sort of fancy language to express what otherwise can't be expressed.
Right. And you and Peter think it has to do with kind of our incentive structure. It's funny, for a guy that made a bunch of money in tech, you would think he would be a quote unquote capitalist, but he thinks that system, he doesn't believe in ridiculous.
He doesn't believe in the market.
Yeah, the market.
He knows the market as well as anybody.
Yeah, and he doesn't really believe in just the competition, the fierce competition in the market. He believes in create a monopoly and be able to kind of run that as a business, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting in a way, because he does recognize that this sort of frenetic competition doesn't bring out people's creativity. It's interesting because when you put out questions for people to answer, one of the ones I got was, well, don't you think having a free society where everybody's equal is going to have terrible effects on innovation because people need like monetary incentives to be able to create things? I think history shows exactly the opposite.
Right, because they were saying that an anarchy movement wouldn't give people the incentive monetarily to invent. And that was their question. And you said,
and then I said, well, no, it would give people the means and the time to invent. Because have you ever met a rich inventor? I guess there's one or two that actually made it.
Thiel.
But yeah, he's not really, he's an investor.
Right.
But the vast majority of inventors know perfectly well they're going to get ripped off. They do it anyway. We have a system that incentivizes like creative people terribly. They almost always get crushed and destroyed or ripped off, exploited, but they still do it. So if anything proves that people don't just do this for the money, this is it, I can't imagine there would be a society that like incentivizes people less to be really creative and inventive. People are creative and inventive because they're creative and inventive. So the question is like how to get them the means. The conclusion I wrote in that piece I wrote about flying cars and why there's so little scientific creativity now is I said, well, this isn't rocket science, well, except insofar as it is. But I said, if you want to maximize creativity, get a bunch of creative people and just let them be. Give them whatever resources they need and give them a comfortable place to stay. Maybe let them hang out with each other. And a lot of them will come up with nothing, but a few of them will probably come up with something that even they wouldn't have imagined. Now, if you want to minimize the possibility of creative breakthroughs, it's also pretty easy to see how to do that. You get those same people and tell them, okay, we're not going to give you any resources at all unless you spend most of your time competing with one another to prove to me that you already know what you're going to invent. Well, that's the system we got now. And it's hardly surprising we don't have any of these new technologies.
Right, and that previous scenario you're talking about sounds like a university where you go.
Yeah, that was the old idea.
Express your ideas. We were talking about great inflation earlier, but the idea where you could just think, and then these days, especially in say a place like Silicon Valley, is that you have to find the funds, prove the capital, work to do it, compete to the very top, die, and then there'll be a winner.
Yeah, and it's absurd because you end up spending all your time writing grants, reading grants, trying to cut down other people's grants, reviewing things. People have said Einstein would have been destroyed. He never could have, first of all, stuff wouldn't have been published. He never would have got to the point where he would have published it. And you look at the sort of people who are actually responsible for creative breakthroughs, not just the scientists, but the social thinkers. Like, you don't even have to talk about real weirdos like Nietzsche. What about anybody from Max Weber to Foucault, Deleuze, all these guys are kind of the heroes of the academy nowadays. None of those guys would have gotten tenure in a university. They would have been kicked out as weirdos almost immediately.
All right, and we'll talk about your tenure time in America, but we'll get to that. Just to finish up on Peter, you said that while you guys agreed on a few things, you said there were some big blind spots that he had. Is that because of his wealth or
pretty much?
Is it really? Is it that?
Yeah, I think the most telling thing in that debate was I was saying, well, why are you all worried about democracy, social inequality? People, all you need to do is create a free environment where people can pursue their visions and be rewarded for it, and things will flow for themselves. And I said, well, the problem we have is that 98% of the people who could be coming up with new innovative ideas, are working 12 hours a day in a Nike factory in Indonesia because their father got kicked off the land by some neoliberal reform and this is the only way they can feed their family. Who knows what those guys could be inventing? if they actually had the time. I did a TED Talk once, and I kind of did the anti-TED Talk. I don't know if anybody ever noticed, but
I didn't watch it.
It was an alt-TED. And I basically pointed out that I talked about political pleasure, but the point that I made is that, it's not like we're lacking for good ideas. There's probably nobody in the world, not a single person, who couldn't come up with one creative idea that neither of us would have thought of, some creative solution to a problem none of us would have anticipated. Everybody's got something like that in them. The problem is, the vast majority of people on Earth are being told to shut up every day. Nobody cares what they think. If we created a system that opens that up, who knows? And we'd have an endless deluge of potential solutions to problems. And that's what people like Peter Thiel don't recognize, that there are structures of violence telling people to shut up, because it didn't happen to them.
Structures of violence.
Yeah, if you're in a situation where the only way you can support your family is to work in a factory or become a prostitute or whatever you have to do, and you're a poor person in Indonesia, well, it is a structure of violence. If you don't do that, then you can't have food. If you try to take the food, they'll hit you. They'll lock you up.
Economic prison or...
Yeah, okay. These things can only be enforced ultimately by violence. It's what I call structural violence. There's a set of rules that couldn't exist without ultimately appealing to someone with a stick or a gun to beat you up if you break the rules. And as an anarchist, people ask me this all the time. They say, well, you're for the NHS, right? You're for public resources. Isn't that government? Well, how can you be an anarchist and be for that? And I always say, I make a distinction between institutions that could exist without violence and ones that couldn't. Any institution that could exist without ultimately being able to call up somebody with a stick or a gun to say, look, I don't care what you think, shut up and do what you're told. If you don't have recourse to that, and you could still run the organization anyway, that's fine.
Okay, and that includes NHS, what other organizations?
It's a test. We don't really know until we try. But, any sort of collective management of some resource could be organized without violence,
so I was about to ask
systematic.
The definition of an anarchist, because I think it's hard because most people don't know what an anarchist is. They take this extreme thing in their mind, or someone in history that was throwing a bomb at someone, or they don't know. Is that the definition?
No, that's one of the ironies. Everybody's got in their minds this idea of bomb-throwing anarchist. If you look at the last 50 years, anarchism is probably the only political movement whose exponents never bomb anybody. When's the last time an anarchist blew somebody up? Anything else, like conservatives, liberals, social democrats, they blow people up all the time. Right. We never blow anybody up. Where are we the bomb throwers?
But you have a PR problem, right? Anarchy needs a little bit of PR.
Well, there's nothing that makes
branding.
People running things more upset. If you say, you're evil, I want to kill you, they don't like that. But in a kind of way they do, because it makes them important. If you say, you're completely pointless and unnecessary, we're going to carry on without you, that really annoys people. So, anarchism annoys the people in power a lot more than people who simply hate them.
And you ignore the government. Is that the way you empower? You are an anarchist?
Well, that's the idea of direct action.
Okay.
I've once said that direct action is the defiant insistence on acting as if you're already free. So that's the difference between protest and, say, civil disobedience and direct action. Civil disobedience, you can say, well, I think this is terrible. I'm going to block the streets. I'm going to surround your office. But you're ultimately trying to make the people in power change their minds.
Okay.
Whereas in direct action, you're ignoring them. So Gandhi actually was a famous direct actionist in that sense, the Salt March. Instead of saying we won't pay our taxes or we are going to sit down and block City Hall until you get rid of the monopoly on salt, he just said salt should be a human right. It should be we're going to march down and make salt. You try to stop us.
Right, okay. Yeah. It was the Occupy movement direct action?
It was in that sense.
Okay.
Because the idea of the Occupy movement was exactly that. Everybody's got creative ideas. Nobody's listening to us. To hell with politicians. We're going to just try to set up structures that could exist in a free society, where people organize themselves, show that representative democracy isn't necessary. We can collectively make decisions by ourselves using a non-hierarchical, directly democratic approach. And so running the camp was a model for how you could run anything.
And that was at Zuccotti Park.
Zuccotti Park, and millions, probably millions of people across the world in different squares did similar things. It really started in in Tunisia, Egypt, Tahrir. Then it went on to Greece and Spain, Sintagma, and Plaza de Catalunya. And a lot of those people actually helped us. You know, there were people from, there's one guy from Egypt, there are definitely people from Greece and Spain in Zuccotti Park. So, and then from Zuccotti Park, it spread all over the world.
How were you involved in that first few days of the Occupy? You know, it's funny, I asked you I have my pre-interview form here, and a lot of people hate it, including you. But you said you were doing things all your life. You were had thoughts about the 9/11 attacks. You had thoughts about probably the financial crisis, about all these pieces, but it was always the wrong timing. Yale, tenure, the wrong timing. But with Occupy, what you were saying and talking about your whole life seemed to synchronize with other people at the same time? What was
timing?
That?
Well, I mean, I had really bad timing in the sense that, you know, I came out as an anthropological theorist at just the point where anthropology decided we don't like theory anymore. I came out as a proponent of direct action, and then like 9/11 happened like 2 weeks later. Didn't look too good. This sort of thing kept happening to me over and over. It kind of was a direct action. It's not really the kind I was talking about. Yeah, and so this kept happening to me over and over again. I just had the worst timing in the world. And then one day it all came together. It's just like in 2010, I had the best timing conceivable. I came out with this book about debt, you know, just the moment it became like the center issue of all politics. I walked into the middle of this Occupy stuff, and it was just perfect serendipity. And as it happened, I had a year off from school. I had a sabbatical, and I went back to New York to help publicize the book that summer. And I was kind of expecting to go to Madagascar for some of that year. That was my actual plan. But here I was in New York doing book promotions, and I figured, okay, let's activist project, what's going on? So I found out, I went to this meeting at this place called 16 Beaver Street, this kind of art activist center. They were talking about anti-austerity movements around the world, and I met an old friend of mine from Greece named Georgia Sagri, and she said, "Oh, have you heard about this Occupy Wall Street thing? It's been advertised in this magazine called Adbusters. Adbusters is a sort of neo-situationist Canadian magazine by people who work in the advertising industry but hate it, and they do like subversive subvertising, they call it, anti-ads. Anyway, they have this magazine, and they threw out this idea to do an occupation of Wall Street. She said, well, I don't know about that, but they called for a general assembly, and I just got back from Greece where you have these big general assemblies, it's direct democracy, it's really exciting.
General assembly is just where people show up?
A giant meeting where people kind of go through a democratic process to make collective decisions together.
Okay.
For example, in Argentina, after the big economic crash there in 2001, essentially people rejected the government and created their own neighborhood assemblies to manage things.
Okay.
And in a
very
way,
anarchist.
It was very explicitly anarchist, and this is part of the globalization movement. It was a very important moment because this is basically what ended the third world debt crisis. They essentially said, politicians are irrelevant. We will run things by ourselves. It's up to you to prove that you are in any way relevant to our lives. So, and it became, in Argentina, it got to the point where politicians couldn't even go to restaurants anymore. They'd have to wear phony mustaches and stuff like that because if people saw them, they would throw food at them and chase them out. So politicians had to do something to delegitimate themselves. So what they did was they actually abrogated the national debt, which created a cascade of events which ended the third world debt crisis. But we wanted to create something like that, essentially create autonomous institutions which would make politicians have to prove to us that they could do anything for us. That was the idea. That's why we didn't make demands. So we had this idea, okay, General Assembly, and we showed up together. It was at Bowling Green. I remember it well because I walked through Wall Street just to see what it was like, and I'd never seen so much security in my life. There were squads of police, there were horse comps, there were helicopters, there was all these shady looking undercovers, there was sort of lurking obviously around.
Can you spot the undercover cops?
Oh yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Okay, short hair. Okay.
A lot of them wear bracelets. If they're people of color, actually, they have little colored bracelets so that other cops won't beat them up.
Wow, okay. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of stuff you learn when you do direct action. But anyway, so I was walking through all this, and I show up, and there's this meeting. There's a couple hundred people. And I said, okay, General Assembly. Wait, this isn't a General Assembly. It's like a rally. There's people with microphones and cameras on them, kind of improvised stage, and they're revving up the crowd and making speeches, and it's like, oh, this is boring. This is like any other stupid thing. And I went to see Georgia, and she was like, oh, God. And I thought, well, should we just leave? And then I kind of look around, and like I realized everybody in the audience is going, you know, this again, God. And I thought, well, what would happen if we just talked to people and say, hey, look, if we had a real meeting, would you come? Would you leave this thing? And they were like, yeah, shit, yeah, this is boring. So we started whispering and gathering people, and then we kind of defected and tried to create a real meeting. It turned out there was some like Leninist political party or Stalinist. There was.
Do you think people protest that way because they've seen that in the movies, and then when they go down, they try to do that? Or why do you
there
think?
are people who really like that sort of thing because they're in
Okay.
control. We call it verticals versus horizontals. Verticals are people who essentially have a vanguard party that comes up with an analysis, and then they try to lead people. So it's all about non-participatory forms. I mean, you're participating, but you're participating only under the control. So there's some guy leading the chant, there's somebody coming up with printed signs, and you just hold them. Whereas the horizontals are all about creating a democratic process that people collectively decide what to do, and everybody sort of, even the chants are different. Like anybody can start one, and it goes back and forth. And
Okay.
yeah. So, but I looked around. It's like, this isn't a vertical crowd. This is a horizontal crowd. You know. So.
And you can feel it because
Yeah.
you've been doing this.
And
You're a
you look-
pro.
Yeah, and you look at people, you can tell. You know, they got a Zapatista sticker on, or you know, this kind of thing, or IWW. It's like
What's IWW?
those are the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World. It's basically an anarcho-syndicalist union. It's been around for 100 years.
Okay.
Kind of was really big around 1910, and it faded, and now it's kind of coming back again.
Okay, so when you see that, you're like horizontal person, horizontal person.
Yeah.
All right.
So we could tell, you know. So we said, okay, you want to go and, you know, have a real meeting? And we did. And then, of course, the Trotskyists came and said, no, we talked to the organizers, you know, we're going to have a real meeting, come back. And of course, it wasn't true. And then Georgia got on stage and, like, you know, made a speech about how this was nonsense and was practically threatened. And all this stuff happened, but by the end of it, we defected, and everybody went over to our meeting instead of theirs. We formed a circle and said, okay, what are we going to do? And then we realized, oh, we got a problem. Because this magazine had like 40,000 people subscribed to a mailing list, you know, online, where they had advertised the date. And the date was in, I can't remember, it was like 17th, wasn't it, of September?
Yeah.
And this was the end of August. So we realized, oh no, we have like 5 weeks. And they had said, well, bring like 40,000 people to sit on Wall Street until they meet our demands. You know, that was what they wanted. And we're like, but wait a minute, that's absurd. There's no way we can get 40,000 people down onto Wall Street in 5 weeks. They had done nothing in terms of repairing infrastructure, because these guys think you just put out something on the internet, it happens. It's not the way it works. You'd have to set up buses, you'd have to like create local chapters. It would be a whole process. There was no way we could do that in 5 weeks. So we said, okay, what can we actually do? Well, we could try to bring people to shut down Wall Street, but the problem is the day they'd announced was a Saturday, so Wall Street's already shut down. You know, the only way they'd even know we were there is if we're still there on Monday, so it's got to be an occupation of some kind. So I guess we'll have to grab a camp in a park near there. So then we advertised that we were going to do that, but of course if we advertised we were going to be in a park, that park will be shut down. So we advertised we were going to be in a park, we advertised the wrong one. And that park we advertised was immediately surrounded by chain-linked fences and barbed wire, and was for the next 3 years. No one got to use it. But
So you're being watched.
yeah, we know we're being surveilled, everything we do. And so we had like 5 different parks on a map, and we moved numbers, and we handed them out to everybody at the event. And we weren't sure who was going to show up. But you know, as the day went on, more and more people came, and they seemed to be coming out of the woodwork. So we gave them all the little map, and then when the moment came, we said, okay, it's number 3, which was Zuccotti Park.
That was Zuccotti Park.
Yeah.
Why'd you choose that, or how did you guys
No,
choose that?
it was nearby. It was big enough. You could fit people. It was within sight of a lot of important places like the Federal Reserve, not of Wall Street itself, but it was far enough away that they wouldn't immediately expel us. And then we had a giant democratic meeting to decide, well, what are we going to do? We're going to march to Wall Street now. We're going to stay here, and that's when we came up with the People's Microphone, which had usually, you know, we'd used it before, but the People's Microphone was normally used for getting information out in a hurry. Say you're on the street and like you want to say the cops are coming from the north, you know, there seem to be a bunch of them, may want to get out of here. You know, you don't have a megaphone. Usually megaphones are illegal. So you have people repeat what you say, and then other people repeat what they said and kind of pass it on, and it goes down the line. But we never used it in a meeting before. But the problem was, actually we made a little mistake. we formed a circle. We figured that'd be more democratic, but we had a lot more people than we expected, like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people. It's a lot.
This is what date? Like
This
mid-September?
is still the first day.
First day, September 17th.
Yeah, 17th. Yeah.
Okay.
And it was getting
3,000-4,000
evening.
people. That's a lot.
And we tried. We had like microphones actually, because the cops hadn't told us not to yet. But the problem is when you have a circle, you have to have them pointing in different directions and megaphones, and we were trying to like create some sort of thing where they'd be like pointing this way and that way. It didn't work. And like some of the Spaniards said, "You idiot, you're supposed to form a crescent with columns so people can walk up," and it was too late. So we thought, okay, what do we do? All right, we can use the people's microphone. So everybody will just say a sentence and everybody repeats it.
And that works?
That worked.
Okay. And it goes out, it propagates out.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a small enough crowd that could work with, if everybody who could hear it repeated it, then everyone would hear it.
Okay.
It worked okay. But the problem, the thing about that, though, it actually had a really interesting effect because we kept using it. And one reason we kept using it was it stopped people from speechifying. You're not going to say anything that you don't have to say if like 1,000 people are going to have to repeat it. So instead of just going on and on and on, people kept to the point. So it was actually kind of a democratic tool.
Right, keeps it very horizontal.
Yeah.
What, looking back on that whole thing that happened there, like when was the day when you were like, whoa, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, this is bigger than I thought?
The very first day was way bigger than we thought.
Okay.
Yeah, and what we did was we went out. I have a friend, Marissa Holmes, who's like probably the single most important organizer. And she's also a filmmaker. And she went out with a video camera that night and talked to all the people she didn't recognize, which is most of them. It wasn't the usual suspects. And asked, well, who are you? Why are you here? What motivated you to do this? And the overwhelming majority were debt refugees. They all said, well, I never thought of myself as an activist, but this is ridiculous. I'm one of the good kids. I worked hard. I went to school. A lot of them were from relatively modest backgrounds, but they studied hard. They got a scholarship, but they still have to go way into debt, even if you get a scholarship. So they were like, I did what I was told. I'm $40,000 in debt. I got a degree. I got good grades. Then suddenly what happens? The economy crashes because these bankers, they totally broke all the rules. They didn't play by the rules at all. Yet they got bailed out. I didn't get bailed out. And now I'm going to be treated like I'm a deadbeat for the rest of my life because I can't get a job because they crashed the economy and I owe money to them. This is completely unfair. And that was, we just heard that over and over again.
And that was unusual because you were used to kind of a different crowd that would show up to these meetings.
It wasn't so immediately personal. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Interesting. And when did you come up with the term, we are the 99%? Or what is the story behind that? I'm sure there are tons of stories.
No, it's fairly simple. I mean, the phrase the 1% was being bounced around that time. I think Krugman wrote a column about it. People were talking about it. And it was just a matter of reversing it. And this was before Zuccotti Park. This is when we were first, after that initial meeting, we came up with a democratic process. We started having regular weekly meetings. We formed working groups. So there's like going to be a media working group, a process working group, organizational logistics, and so forth and so on. So I was part of the outreach working group. What are we going to tell people? Come join us. Who are we? So first,
PR.
It was basically PR. And there were two. There was one for the web, and then we were the sort of actual leafleting, going out to talk to people. And the first question we had was, who are we? Because, Adbusters had said, we should have our one key demand. So their idea was the meeting should be to decide on that. We decided, no, we're not going to do that. Because if you make a demand, you're essentially saying we want politicians to intervene, to do something to solve our problems. We thought that was sending the wrong message. Again, we're thinking of Argentina and cases like that. It's a much better way of saying, prove to us that you are in any way relevant. You're just talking about stupid things that have nothing to do with our real problems.
Right.
We're going to talk about our real problems ourselves and see if we can't solve them.
And a demand isn't direct action.
No, it's exactly the opposite. Right. Direct action means try to solve your own problems rather than try to get other people to intervene, even if you're using radical means to do so. It's indirect. So we thought about that. And we thought, all right. If that's the case, the next question is, who are we? Who do we represent? And at that time, there was a phrase, the 1%, and I thought, well, what's interesting about the 1% is that it's not just about social class, it's about class power. Because the 1% were not only the people who had basically got all of the advantages of economic growth, because since 2008 there had been a sort of starting to be a recovery, but all the money was going to 1% of the population. Everybody else was like as poor or poorer than they had been before. And so they were the people who were getting all the money, but they were also the people who made all the campaign contributions. If you look at the way the American political system works, I mean, it's like some ridiculous amount. 98% of the money that goes to politicians is coming from 1% of the population.
And this is pre-Super PAC.
Yeah, it was before that. But even before they changed a lot of the rules around.
Okay.
It has always been like that. Citizens United, that was it. I think it was pre-Citizens United, but it didn't matter. I mean, basically, the thing about the American political system is it's a system of institutionalized bribery. If you look at, like, when they talk about political corruption around the world and they have indexes, U.S. usually comes out toward the bottom. And I was always surprised by that. But then I realized, well, Nigeria or Russia often come out on top. Well, that's because in Nigeria and Russia, it's still illegal to give politicians money to influence their vote. In America, it's not illegal. So, of course, we don't look corrupt.
Should it be the number one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you look at morally, I think it would be the most corrupt.
So you identified this, and that kind of led you to the 99%?
Yeah, we identified that because we realized, okay, the 1% are the people who not only control the political process, but then because of their control of the political process, arrange things in such a way that they get all the profits. It's hardly even capitalist anymore. If you look at the way the American economy works, and this is true of here of UK and most of what they call, sort of advanced capitalist countries, a little less of places like Germany. Manufacturing and commerce is a relatively minor share of where the profits are coming from for the city, for Wall Street. Most of it's finance. And people say, oh, finance, it's like speculative. It's like taking bets on things and they're just making up money. And yeah, that's kind of true. But there is a connection between finance and the real economy. Finance is a word for other people's debts. And what it really means is, you bribe politicians, you set up legislation which will guarantee that people are in debt, and then you use government to regulate and manage that debt. So the class of rentiers, of people who are actually collecting this money, and the government, they almost overlap. There's a single sort of bureaucratic web, and you can't even tell what's public and private. But it's all designed in such a way as to guarantee profits for certain people who have political power.
Right,
so that's what we were talking about with the 1%. They're those guys.
Okay, and the average citizen has all of these debts just to be alive, and those all come in the forms of
and those debt
labor.
Refugees were exactly the people who showed up at Zuccotti Park.
Okay, so you took the 1%, we are the 99%.
So I threw out, well, we have to figure out who we are. Why don't we call ourselves the 99%? Everybody's talking about the 1%. And then we had to put out a leaflet. So I think Georgia, the Greek anarchist friend of mine, and 2 Spanish indignados were part of the PR committee, outreach working group, as we called it, and they came up with a little flyer saying, we the 99%. And then it was this Food Not Bombs guy, Korean Food Not Bombs organizer, who put up a Tumblr page called We Are the 99%. So in a way, the slogan was created by committee, but it came out well.
Okay, and it hit. It became big.
It became huge.
Huge.
People put out these little signs. That was what the Tumblr page was. It was like anybody who can't actually come to the protests because you're too busy working and your 3 jobs or whatever it is. The idea was like put up a little sign and have a picture of yourself holding up the sign, sort of describing your life and why you feel you are the 99%. They would all end. I am the 99%. And we got thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And it was really interesting because about 80% of them were women, but even the ones who were guys they were all kind of in the caring professions or kind of professions where you want to do good in the world. Either they were in health or they were in education or they were social workers. There are people who, and they're all saying the same thing. There's a very, very broad similarity in the kind of complaint. Essentially what it came down to was, I want to pursue a career where I can be proud of what I do, where I don't have to at least be embarrassed by what I do, where I help other people. But if I want to do a job where I care for other people in some way, they will pay me so little and put me so much in debt, I can't take care of my own family. This is ridiculous.
And that's why they rallied behind you.
Yeah.
In retrospect, now that you look back at it, Occupy Wall Street, what did you accomplish and what did you fail to accomplish?
Well, I mean, I think we managed to get the government really scared. I mean, that's why they suppressed us. I think we accomplished a lot. Think about it this way. I think nobody in America even talked about social class. It was the great taboo since the 1930s, really. And we broke that, and suddenly inequality was all anybody can talk about. I think, we could say our greatest victory came when, Obama gave a speech about inequality, which nobody cared about before we were there. And the Republicans responded, and both Republican responses did not say inequality was unimportant, which they certainly would have said, before we came along. They all said, yes, you're right, inequality is a big problem, but you have the solution wrong. So once you've changed the terms of debate so that both sides have to at least pretend they agree with you, there's been a major change in the way people think about their problems. I think that was our biggest success. We've changed the terms of debate, what people thought political issues actually were. In terms of, I think our biggest strategic miscalculation was that we trusted the mainstream left to be more strategically sensible. Because the right wing, the mainstream right wing in America is very strategically smart. They know that the average Republican thinks like an anti-abortion activist or a militia guy. They think they're nuts. They don't actually take those people seriously. They think it's really important those people exist, because that makes them seem like a moderate.
Okay.
Yeah. And we figured that a liberal Democrat would see us and say, great, we'll support these guys, and then we'll come to the table and say, well, those guys might be kind of crazy, but we're reasonable, let's talk about these issues. And it would totally play into to their advantage. The way I always put it is that, if the Democratic Party was as absolutist about First Amendment rights as the Republican Party is about Second Amendment rights, gun rights, then we'd still be there, But unfortunately, those guys really don't think that way. I guess there's various reasons you could say.
They didn't support you when you thought they would.
When the time came that the cops came in, we expected they would raise a huge fuss about the violence, about repression. I mean, essentially, the First Amendment is pretty clear. It says Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or freedom of assembly. And everybody says, well, you have the right to freedom of assembly, you just have to ask the cops first. It's like, no, if you have to ask the cops before you speak, that's called not having freedom of speech. You have to ask the cops before you print something, that's called not having freedom of the press. Why is it different with assembly? But they basically said, oh, well, First Amendment, whatever.
And that's the media and
Yeah.
and politicians and anyone on the left, you thought they would sound off a little more.
We thought that they would know that it was in their interest that we continue to exist.
Okay.
Maybe they didn't back us. Basically, you can't sell out your radicals on policy issues if you've already sold them out on existential issues, is the way I always put it.
Okay.
Republicans even understand that, Democrats don't. So at first they thought, oh, it'll be like the Tea Party, will incorporate them, we'll get them. And this has always annoys me. They're like, people are still, you meet these sort of moderate left, they'll say, well, you Occupy people, you should have run political candidates, you should have supported campaigns, you shouldn't have stayed aloof from politics, it's all your fault, I really oppose your decision. And it's like, excuse me, we don't tell you what to do. We became big because we rejected the political process because everybody thinks it's illegitimate. We're supposed to do what you can't do. Nobody's stopping you from going out and running for, your political candidates and campaigning for them. It didn't work, did it? And we did something that did work. So you want us to stop because you can't do what you want to do?
But people are expecting a next step that they've seen before, right? They want a next predictable step. So when they see Occupy, I think a lot of people were like, okay, and now you should do an X, what we expect. But
right, which is of course what they've been telling us to do for 30 years and people kept trying to do and it always failed. Then somebody tries to do something else, it's amazingly, spectacularly successful, and they're like, yeah, that's fine, but now switch to doing what we told you all along.
Right, understood. Talk to me about violence, because that was picked up on the news. I was here in London, so I saw some of the video, but I never know what it's really like on the ground. And also tell me, what's it?
It's about the most nonviolent movement I ever heard of.
Yeah, no, and I mean the political.
There were 5,000 occupations, and there were 3 broken windows. I mean, the average like mildly rowdy hockey game in Canada has more like broken windows on one night than we did during the entire movement.
Yeah, and I mean
nothing. It was absolutely nothing.
Right, but there was police violence, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, first of all, what's it like being down there day after day? I mean, this is what you do, but most people, then maybe they go for a few hours at one of these things, but I don't know what it's like to be that day after day after day. What's it like? And is that something you're used to?
You get used to it. I mean, but you're always aware that, you know, you can get really seriously hurt at any time. I mean, and cops do stuff like, okay, I have a friend, I can't mention names, who, one of the things the police were doing at a certain point, it was clearly a tactic because they started doing it in Egypt first, you know, systematically like groping women and you know, sort of sexual assault. They grab their breasts, they try to like expose them and things like that. And part of it was to traumatize the women because women were key organizers, but part of it was also to try to provoke the men. You know, the idea is like, aren't you going to offend your women folk? So they'll try to get the men to do something that they could say is violent and then, you know, or put them in prison. So police started doing this, and there's one woman, like, they grabbed her breasts and she said, "What are you, some kind of fucking pervert?" You know,
like yelled, in New York they did
this
that.
Is in New York. Oh,
Undercover.
Yes. Oh, no, they're actually uniformed cops.
Really?
There's lots of pictures of them, yeah. You know, one woman appeared on television the next day with giant handprints on her breast. Then they arrested her later for something else just to punish her for doing that, yeah. Yeah, so they were doing the systematic sexual assault stuff. And one woman just like screamed at some cop, like saying like, what are you, some kind of fucking pervert? Like, what, you know, if somebody ordered you to like sexually assault a woman, that's disgusting. And the cop was so offended they took her behind the lines and broke her wrists. I mean, they do stuff like that.
Right.
Breaking thumbs. I know a guy who's one of the key organizers who is a concert pianist. They broke his fingers and yeah.
And did it feel scary down there? Were there scary days? Were there moments where you're just like, I don't know what's going to happen?
You always, I mean, it's an adrenaline thing. You know what I mean? On the one hand, there's this incredible feeling of freedom because you realize just how much you've never been in a crowd that was self-organized, essentially. You know, every moment you're actually operating under the threat of violence. If I walk this way, if I do this, if I do that, someone could attack me. But you never think about it. You know, and it's something about our society that you know, I used to live in Madagascar. In Madagascar, you know, in a small town, the place where I was, there basically were no police. And insofar as there were police, they didn't concern themselves with, you know, open container laws, or, you know, who can stand here, who can play music there, who can like drink this, eat this, sell this, and this. You know, everything we do is regulated, everything. But we don't think about it. But like those things that are regulated are enforced by violence, and we've learned this. You know, like sell untaxed cigarettes, they could kill you. I mean, obviously in America they can do it fairly easily if you're black. It's harder if you're white, but theoretically they can, you know, I mean, the possibility exists. So we're always under threat. Some people more than others, but everybody. And you just internalize that. You never think about the fact that you're constantly being threatened with violence every moment of the day. But then suddenly when you're in a group of people who are self-organized, you know, you can go down the street any way you want. You can do whatever, suddenly you're free. And it's this like incredible feeling of like, well, yeah, we're facing a risk here, but we're not sheep, you know, we've actually taken control. We've created this free space where we decide what we're gonna do.
To watch the rest of this fascinating interview, click on the link below and go to londonrealacademy.com. There you can sign in with your social media, log in and watch the rest of the episode for free, along with all of our episodes on London Real, my webinars, and all of our premium content, all located over at londonrealacademy.com. So click on the link below, you'll be directed there and you can watch the rest of this fascinating interview, and I'll see you there.